we're going to take a look at the vasculature of the brain. Take your brain and turn it so that the ventral surface of the brain is facing up, and the brain stem here is pointing toward you. The blood vessels of the brain, arterial supply in particular, come from 4 systemic vessels. The 2 vertebral arteries shown right here, coming up from the spinal cord, and the 2 internal carotid arteries. You can see the cut stumps of the internal carotid arteries on each side here in this central area. So just medial to the temporal lobes, just medial to the uncus, you can find those 2 cut stumps of the internal carotid arteries. These 4 vessels supply all the arterial blood to the brain. We're going to look at the branches of the internal carotid arteries first. And the first branch we're going to identify is the anterior cerebral artery. And the anterior cerebral artery runs medially from the internal carotid. You can see it here, anterior cerebral artery, and it runs medially and in between the 2 frontal lobes. It runs into that longitudinal fissure in between the 2 frontal lobes. So you can see the anterior cerebral artery here running between the 2 frontal lobes. So there's one from each side, and the 2 arteries are actually joined in the midline by a small segment known as the anterior communicating artery. And the anterior communicating artery is right there on top of the probe. So just rostral to the optic chiasm, which is here, you should see that anterior communicating artery there. The internal carotid also gives off the middle cerebral artery, which is the largest of the cerebral arteries, and it runs laterally into that lateral fissure, runs into and supplies the lateral aspect of the hemisphere. So there's the middle cerebral artery there, and it will run laterally and come over, and all of its branches will distribute blood to that lateral hemisphere. The internal carotid artery also gives off a small artery called the anterior choroidal artery. And that anterior choroidal artery is right here, coming off right below the stump of the internal carotid. So there's the anterior choroidal, it's pretty small. And it gives off another artery known as the posterior communicating artery. And that posterior communicating artery is right here, runs from the internal carotid back to another artery that's part of the vertebral circulation known as the posterior cerebral. So there's the posterior communicating artery. Now let's look at the vertebral vessels. So here are the 2 vertebral arteries, and they came into the skull alongside the spinal cord, and they will join in the midline to form a single artery that runs along this ventral surface of the brainstem. This is the basilar artery. The basilar artery feeds the pons, and its branches feed many of the structures in the brainstem and the cerebellum. The first 2 branches of the vertebral artery that you will be able to see are the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. So here's a vertebral artery. Coming off of it is a posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and you can trace it onto the posterior inferior surface of the cerebellum. Same thing on this side. We can see a posterior inferior cerebellar artery here, running onto that inferior surface of the cerebellum. There are 2 very small arteries that come off of the vertebral right in the midline and join together to form the anterior spinal artery. So here's the anterior spinal artery running down the midline, the anterior midline of the spinal cord, and there are the 2 little branches of the vertebral that give rise to that anterior spinal artery. The two vertebral arteries then will join in the midline to form the basilar artery, and coming off of the basilar artery very quickly there is the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So we had a posterior inferior cerebellar artery coming off the vertebral artery. Now there's an anterior inferior cerebellar artery coming off of the basilar, and it feeds the more anterior portion of the cerebellum here. There's one of those on each side, one there. Here's the other one on this side, right here. Then the vertebral artery is going to give off several small branches to the pons, and you can see those pontine branches right along here. All those are little pontine branches. And then the vertebral artery will give off, the basilar artery will give off one more branch to the cerebellum, and that is the superior cerebellar artery, shown on this side here and over here on this side. There's the superior cerebellar artery. And then finally, the vertebral artery splits into two posterior cerebral arteries. And here is 1 and 2. So the two posterior cerebral arteries there. And those arteries will feed the occipital lobe and parts of the temporal lobe. Now, right around the optic chiasm, right at the base of the infundibulum, is where the circle of Willis is located. And the circle of Willis is basically an arterial circle. So the two posterior cerebral arteries, posterior communicating artery, internal carotid, anterior cerebral artery, anterior communicating artery, those structures form the circle of Willis, and they form an entire arterial circle there at the base of the brain. And the circle of Willis can provide some redundancy in terms of vertebral flow, in terms of arterial flow to the structures of the brain. So the circle of Willis there, allowing some protection in terms of arterial flow. If one area got blocked over time, another vessel could enlarge and help to compensate for that loss of blood supply. One last vascular structure I want to show you is called a cerebral bridging vein. And to see that, you're going to need to turn your brain over onto the opposite surface so that we can see the surface of the cerebrum. And if you have dura on your brain, you will see some bridging veins. So here is a vein coming off of the surface of the cerebrum and dumping into the dura. It dumps into that superior sagittal sinus, dumps venous blood there, and these veins that come off of the surface of the brain and dump into that sinus go from an area of fairly thin structure. This is all arachnoid that you see. This filmy part is arachnoid. The veins are very thin, and they dump into this very tough dural sinus. And we will talk in lecture about what happens when those veins get damaged.